Hi, I'm Mike Carruthers. Today I'm going to share a story of my memories of my father, Terry Carruthers. Terry Carruthers was passed away a week before Christmas, December 18th, 2016 at the Jackman Manor Care Home in Aldergrove. Dad had had a stroke a couple of months earlier and had not been doing well. The week before, my spouse and Joan and I went to Hawaii on a vacation for a much-needed break, and I was worried about my father. Well, we were gone. Dad did take a turn for the worse, and I had a couple of calls from the care home as well as my sister Elizabeth, and I worried that he would pass before I got a chance to come home and say goodbye. Dad, bless him, waited. We got home late Thursday, and the following day I went with my sister Elizabeth to see Dad instead of waiting for my normal visit on Saturday. We got to say our goodbyes, and he passed late that evening. Elizabeth told me that Dad had been waiting for me. I'm so grateful that I was able to tell him that I loved him and was able to spend some time with him that morning. I know especially now this summer and spring of COVID, that not everyone has had this opportunity. And I'm also grateful that he did not have to live through the lockdown of 2020. It would have been very difficult for him. Dad was born in Vancouver General Hospital on September 20th, 1936. His father, my grandfather, Alan Carruthers, was born in Cayuga, Ontario, and was the president and founder of A.G. Carruthers Wholesale Jewelers in Vancouver. Dad's mother, Grace, was born in England and was a nurse during the First World War. Alan was in England with the Canadian Expeditionary Forces, and from what I understand, met Grace as he was recovering from being gassed in France by the Germans. Grace came to Canada after the war in 1920 to marry Alan. Dad's sister was born in 1938 and 18 months younger than Terry. Dad's childhood was spent primarily in Vancouver with homes in Kitsilano and Dunbar neighborhoods. Their parents went through a particularly rough patch, and Grace went back to spend most of 1931 in England, bringing Terry and Shirley with her. Apparently Alan had had an affair with his secretary, but they somehow managed to patch things up, and Grace returned home to Vancouver. Every summer after Grace's return, the Carruthers family rented the Green Cabin at the Cox Family Resort off the Parksville Beach on Vancouver Island. It was here that my father met his future wife, my mother Isabel Cox, whose grandparents owned the resort. Dad spent time each summer to stay with his Aunt Laura as well and Uncle Angus in the Fraser Valley. He would travel to their farm in Mount Lehman via the Fraser Valley interurban line. There he would get a taste of rural life while being able to play with his cousins Jim and Alan Ryder. As an adolescent, Terry was a sea cadet, and in 1943 joined the Canadian Merchant Marine as a junior officer. He would serve until the war ended in 1945. The war, although terrifying at times, with many of the convoys that Dad was on across the Atlantic, would be losing merchant ships, it was also a great adventure in my father's life. I would later hear from him his stories of traveling up and down the coast of South America, as well as across the Atlantic and up the coast of East Africa. Tales of docking close to German U-boats in neutral ports, and even dancing at a young officers' ball attended by the Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret when in London. The terror of crossing the Atlantic, being on a ship that was sunk in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, a wound in his leg from being strafed by German dive bombers. Dad had quite the adventure during the war. Dad was also an early member of the Merchant Marines Veterans Association, and it was partly due to their voice and pressure that the merchant mariners were eventually recognized as veterans by the Canadian government. Veterans Affairs were a real blessing in providing support to Dad for housing and other care in his later years. After the war, Dad went to work for his father at A.G. Carruthers Wholesale Jewelers. But in 1953 at the Marine Drive Golf Club, where he was a member, Alan Carruthers had a heart attack and never made it home. Dad was not cut out to manage the company, and after it was dissolved, he went to work on the road as a commission sales agent in the jewelry and giftware industry. It was during this time also that he lost his mother, who passed away in 1955. It was a good time to be on the road immediately following the war, as there was a great demand for consumer goods. Dad went on to develop a vast sales territory, supplying primarily small independent jewelry and gift shops across Western Canada from Vancouver Island to Manitoba. While Dad was not cut out for management, his natural friendliness along with his outgoing personality was certainly cut out for sales. Dad and Mom married in 1951. My sister Elizabeth was born in 52. I arrived in 56, and my younger sister Sheila rounded out the family in 1958. However, being away so much, I'm sure, contributed to the breakdown of my parents' marriage. Dad and Mom separated in 1965 and divorced a year later in 1966. After the separation, we fell in with a new routine with Dad, who picked us up for a visit every Saturday when in town. These visits often included a trip to the A&W Drive-In in North Vancouver, followed by an afternoon bowling at the 5-Pin Lanes off Lower Lonsdale. My sisters and I certainly did get an early opportunity to sample the entire Burger family menu. And if it was dinner time, A&W would invariably be replaced by KFC. Dad surprised us after the divorce by coming home from his first post-divorce road trip with a new wife, sharp dog Doreen, and Cindy the dog. We had no forewarning of his marriage and only met Doreen when he introduced her to us. Doreen was from Manitoba and had been a camp baker. With Doreen, the meals went a little beyond KFC, and we often enjoyed her big white dinner rolls if we were with Dad and Doreen for summer vacation, all the big fluffy pancakes we could eat. To help cover his vast territory, Dad owned a series of giant Chrysler sedans with huge trunks to carry all his clothes and samples. Doreen would travel with him on his first few trips after the marriage, but as her health began to falter, Dad's sole companion was his little adopted border collie, Cindy. I remember taking long weekend drives in Dad's car to visit his aunt and uncle in Mount Lehman. On these outings, Cindy would bark at every cow and horse that we would pass, and also any pieces of shrubbery that may resemble a cow and horse. It must have been quite a trip going across the prairies with her every year. My most precious boyhood time with my father were the times we went fishing together. Dad had always loved to fish. In fact, it was his only real hobby. My first fish memories when I was about 6 years old. We were living in Horseshoe Bay, and Dad then owned a small boat that he kept at the Sewell's Marina. On one special visit, I managed to fall into the water between two small dock sections. I was about 6 years old at the time, and as I fell in, the docks closed above my head, and I remember just seeing bubbles. The docks then moved apart, and Dad grabbed me and pulled me out of the water, soaking wet. Dad drove us home so that we could change. I was terrified, not by the near drowning, but afraid that Mom, after my near drowning, would not let us go fishing. His fishing, like Dad, was not complex or technical. We did not go fly fishing or went after anything like steelhead. We would just put a line in the water and start the boat. No matter what the target, salmon in the ocean or trout or kokanee in the interior lakes, we were always content to just pull a troll for as long as it took to get a bite. The only thing guaranteed is that if we took my little sister Sheila, is that she would catch all the fish. Fishing with Dad are among my happiest childhood memories. Before each trip, Dad prepared for me and my sisters a trip itinerary that included a list of all hotels and motels with addresses and dates. Instead of phone calls, we would receive every couple of weeks a postcard or letter with his almost indecipherable handwriting. We were, of course, expected to write him back, and I'm sure Dad appreciated finding our letters and waiting for him at his many stops. In addition to his letters, and it was great to receive mail as a kid, I often received on his return small felt pennants from small towns across Western Canada. I suppose it was not surprising that when I was old enough to have my own car, that my first big road trip was a trip out to Winnipeg to see many of the small western towns that I had seen on my dad's schedule and pennants that I had received throughout my childhood. The first trip shortly after high school would be that trip to Winnipeg, and it would be my first trip in Canada outside of British Columbia. Only then did I get a sense of the vastness of not only Western Canada, but Dad's territory. In Winnipeg, I met Dad at the famous Marlborough Hotel, famous for being on his itinerary every year. This is where Dad would set up an annual showroom in one of the local hotel suites to show off his newest wares to customers who came to the hotel's annual wholesale jewelry show. From Winnipeg, I followed Dad and then his constant companion, little border collie Cindy, to some smaller Manitoba towns. It was lovely to see how Dad was welcomed in each town from his longtime customers. There were friendships built over time. He and Cindy were truly at home on the road. And his customers were not only his only friends in these towns. I'll never forget an afternoon visiting with him outside of Nepo, a Hutterite colony. How we knew these folks, I don't know, but it was part of another world that Dad was off to twice a year. A few years later, I experienced the same sense of welcome when I traveled briefly with him in Alberta. There I met Dad at the then famous from our itinerary, the Ambassador Inn, the motel that had been on his Calgary home as long as I could read his itineraries. It was the end of his Calgary portion of this trip when I arrived. The highlight of my one night at the Ambassador Inn with Dad was going for dinner with him and having a Caesar salad made at our table in a giant salad bowl that may well have been supplied by my father, as a regular by the staff who seemed excited to meet Dad's son. The following morning we headed to Edmonton. Now there was an important distinction between this road trip and the last time I had met Dad in Winnipeg. During the Winnipeg trip, I remember meeting up in a hotel pub with Dad and one of his customers. Dad had, since the Winnipeg trip 2 or 3 years previously, became a born-again Christian. He'd given up alcohol, as he'd given up the subscription to the Playboy magazine that used to sit next to his lazy boy chair when he was back home. The Playboys and previously ever-present bottle of 5-star whiskey were no longer part of Dad's life. Dad was energized by his conversion, and indeed seemed to have a new focus in his life. It had been a tumultuous time for him. In 1978, Doreen died after a few years of poor health exacerbated by an addiction to pills. In 1979, he married his third wife, Charlotte Allison, who he had met at church. Charlotte was a difficult woman to like, and this contributed to not seeing Dad so often as I had in the past when he was home. We arrived in Edmonton on a Sunday, and Dad wanted to go to church. For the first time, I agreed to join him, and we went to a large Pentecostal church, far different from the limited experience that I had visited Anglican churches in my youth. And the large church was crowded and full of energy. It was more like a concert with loud guitars, lots of shouting, and people giving themselves up to the Holy Spirit. It was in this chaotic, crazy, loud, born-again environment that I unexpectedly, surprising both myself and my father, responded to a call to come to the front with perhaps another half dozen people to give myself to the Lord. That experience now is somewhat a blur. I remember this teenage boy greeting me backstage, and as a then theater student, I can only identify it now as backstage. He was very excited for me. I don't even remember now what he was trying to tell me. The memory, however, that does stick in me now is how happy my father was. That afternoon, or perhaps the following morning, he gave me proudly a King James Bible, and I shortly left thereafter, stunned and numb, as I headed back to Vancouver on my motorcycle. My actual conversion was probably a little slower than Dad may have imagined, and Edmonton was also fast and a little overwhelming. I'm not sure what happened that day, Was I truly called, or did I just want to please my father? It was only after I married my wife Joan, that I attended her family's United Church in Burnaby, and there we were married. And then after moving to Toronto, I started going to church again regularly. Joan and I lived in Toronto for 13 years, from 1982 to 1995, and it was there in Toronto that our son was born in 1991, our son Pierce. During the trips home to Vancouver, I would also meet up with Dad's coffee gang, who met weekly at the St. Regis Hotel at Seymour and Dunsmuir, down the street from the former offices of A.G. Carruthers Wholesale Jewelers. The coffee gang were longtime friends that were all associated with the wholesale jewelry and giftware business. Some were travelers like my father, others in the wholesale jewelry business like my grandfather, and some indeed had known my grandfather. It was often easier to visit Dad there than at his home in North Vancouver, where Charlotte seldom made us feel welcome. I first met the boys when I worked briefly with Dad in the giftware business. Dad got me my first job in Vancouver working with S.P. Myers from Montreal. I represented them in Greater Vancouver and ran their Vancouver showroom. And while Dad traveled for them in the interior and north of BC, as well as across the prairies. I would continue this career in Toronto, representing S.P. Myers and a number of other companies after Joan and I moved there for Joan to attend graduate school. After we moved to Toronto, I would only see Dad occasionally when we returned home for a visit, which was generally at Christmas time. When Joan, Pierce, and I finally did move back to Vancouver in 1995 to live, I resumed my weekly visits with Dad, but now on Wednesdays instead of Saturday, where I would meet up with Dad and the boys for coffee, as I had in the past. But this time, the St. Regis Hotel had turned into a Starbucks, and Dad and the boys were definitely not a Starbucks crowd, so we moved our visits to the cafe at Hudson Bay Company on the 6th floor, just up on Seymour Street. There were changes in Dad's life that impacted our relationship. Dad had moved from North Vancouver to Aldergrove to live on the property that his now third wife, Charlotte, had owned. Charlotte, like Doreen before her, health was deteriorating, and Dad and Charlotte were now living in squalor in an old mobile home on the property. Charlotte's son David also lived in the property in a nice house that he had shared with his wife and son. Things would only get worse from there. Dad's trips became less frequent, and as the market changes, with many of his longtime customers closing down their shops and retiring, and his most popular giftware companies closing down. He also lost his major jewelry line over a dispute with Samples, and his long road trips were now no longer profitable as he needed to be home to look after Charlotte. I found it difficult to interfere in Dad's life and did not like visiting him in Aldergrove. My family certainly felt very uncomfortable visiting there, and Charlotte was not very pleasant, and I had hated dragging Joan and Pierce to the visits, so I regret not supporting Dad more actively through this difficult period. In time, David's family split in part due to David's drug addiction, and Charlotte was eventually placed in a hospice by the Langley Hospital. I found out years later that what little Dad earned was also helped to support David, and after Charlotte's death, Dad turned over most of the property sale proceeds to David. It was all very ugly, and I need to credit Dad's future stepdaughter, Jocelyn, who helped pull Dad out of this mess after Dad married Jocelyn's mother, Helen, about a year after Charlotte's passing. As Dad returned to a more normal, happier life with Helen after selling the Aldergrove property, I began to see Dad more. It was certainly easier to visit Dad in the tidy little townhouse that he moved into with Helen than the messy squalor of the mobile home in Aldergrove. It was after a few short years living with Helen that Dad and Helen's health both deteriorated. Dad had continence issues that Helen could not help with, and Dad started to suffer from dementia. His sister Shirley died of a severe case of Alzheimer's during this period. Fraser Health found a room for Dad at Jackman Manor, where he spent the last 9.5 years of his life. It was during this last period that I became closer to my father. I took over legal representation of him and his affairs as Jocelyn did with her mother. There was a great desire from Helen and her family to find a place where they could remain together, but due to affordability and the fact that Dad became settled and at home at Jackman Manor, and as his dementia progressed, that Dad stayed at Jackman. Dad and Helen instead, with the assistance of Handy Dart family and a private service, managed regular visits with each other's. Dad was a proud member of the Full Gospel Businessmen's Association chapter in Langley, and it's his group of friends there that helped support Dad over the years, especially with his troubles with Charlotte and his eventually marriage to Helen. Dad attended often their weekly lunches with Helen. They were very supportive in assisting Helen and Dad on and off the Handy Dart bus. Dad seldom missed a meeting during his time at Jackman. It was only after his stroke in October 2016, shortly after his 90th birthday, that he could no longer attend. It was during his time at Jackman that I saw Dad the most frequently. I tried my best, work permitting, to visit Dad weekly. I would often take him out to the Tim Hortons in Abbotsford, or sometimes the Swiss Chalet or White Spot for lunch. It was during this time that I heard more of Dad's stories about his adventures during the war. Dad was not a complex man. He was humble. He was gentle. He was outgoing and kind to everyone he met. Dad had a way of making me feel important. He always made me smile while bragging that I was his #1 son. Dad was always good for an ego boost. Apart from family and faith, Dad had one true passion in his life, and that was fishing. Fishing had been our together father and son times in my youth. My last fishing trip with Dad was a few years ago. It was not really a fishing trip exactly, but an outing where we went along with my son Pierce and his friend to the stock fishing pool just down the street. This may have been the first fish Pierce had ever caught. Dad himself was just as excited as the kids as he hooked their first fish, and Dad hooked his last fish. I regret now that I did not take him back a couple more times. Dad was ready to leave us during his last week. He was just waiting for me to come home to say goodbye. He told my sister that he wanted to go down the hall. Elizabeth was convinced that in that hallway he saw his parents, his sister, and others that had crossed over before him. I know he was convinced that his Lord was ready to welcome him with open arms. On the night he died, he willingly, without fear, went down that hallway. I am sure he will in turn be waiting for me and all the others that he loved when it is our turn to take that journey. I strive to love others as my Father loved me. It was his greatest gift.